Hello and welcome to the virtual Peoria Riverfront Museum. My name is Zach Zetterberg. I am the curator of art here at the museum, and I'm here to host the second of three guitar gallery live sessions with our special guest and a new friend to the museum, HP Newquist. HP is the mastermind behind a terrific traveling guitar exhibition that we will be bringing to the museum later this year in September, called Guitar, the Instrument That Rocked the World. This exhibition will be wrapping up the year of guitar here in Peoria. And I have to say, these last few months, the music community in Peoria has really stepped up and helped the museum bring you guys some really great performances and entertainment, and we're going to keep doing that as we move forward here with the museum in the months to come. I'm really excited to have HP back for a second time. If you didn't see last week, HP is the founder and executive director of the National Guitar Museum. He is also a very accomplished author. He's written over 24 books on subjects that are related to music, the brain, and artificial intelligence.
Yes, all of the above.
And he is also a former editor-in-chief of Guitar Magazine in the 90s. So this second session, we're going to talk about the history of the acoustic guitar. Last week, we sort of set up the framework for the exhibition and got to know HP a little bit. If you didn't see that, tune into our YouTube channel or our Facebook page. You can see that. But if you're here with us live, thank you. And please, everyone, welcome HP Newquist for our second live guitar session. How you doing, HP?
Good, Zach. Thanks for having me back for another week.
Absolutely. It's great to see you again. I've been looking forward to it. And tonight we're going to hear your thoughts on the history of the acoustic guitar. Just a small subject, correct?
It's a small subject, but it's got a lot of years behind it. What we'll do is basically talk about how the acoustic guitar came into being and what it evolved from, what its history is. We're not going to get too nerdy about it, too geeky. We don't want to get, turn people off. We want to talk about the instrument that you've all seen people from, Paul McCartney to Elvis Presley to Taylor Swift play. And what makes it work, why it's popular today, and how we got here with it.
Cool. Will a lot of this information be included in the exhibition?
Yes. Okay. As a matter of fact, we do have panels and photos and videos throughout the exhibition. It will cover a lot of this information, and you'll be seeing a lot of these instruments. Actually, you'll be seeing all of these instruments in the exhibit itself.
Great. All right. Well, do you want to start us out at the beginning here?
Yeah, let's see if I can jump us over to the actual presentation. Hold on just a second, everybody.
Yeah, okay.
Put on my glasses here. I'm going to share a screen with you. Let's see. Can you see that, Zach?
Yeah, it looks great.
All right. So now, can you see that? Did that go?
Yes, it did.
All right, good.
Very good.
So as I started out saying, these instruments, as a matter of fact, these two specific instruments are in the exhibit, and we've been collecting instruments for a long time. These actually happen to be two that I collected maybe 40 years ago. Which brings up a question. People are like, well, where are they now? We're waiting for them to come to Peoria. They're actually in Birmingham, Alabama, at the McWane Science Center, where they are being exhibited currently. And McWane has had them for most of the year, including during the pandemic shutdown. But they've been in 24 different museums over the course of the last 10 years. So we're really excited for the first time to be bringing to Illinois via the Peoria Riverfront Museum.
That's
So these
great.
are the first two instruments that you'll see when you come into the exhibit. And you'll notice something really interesting about them. First of all, even though this isn't readily obvious, both of them have origins that go back 5,000 years. And we call that basically prehistory, because we know we can date them back to 3000 BC, not these particular ones, but the actual history of the instrument back to 3000 BC. And anything older than that is considered prehistory, because then we don't have things that were written down about them. So these go back as far in history as we can possibly go in anything. They're probably prehistoric, but we know they go back 5,000 years. And they represent two different origins of what we know today as a guitar. On the left, you have the Nyatiti, and you'll see it's round. It's got lots of strings, and it's got a crossbar, kind of like a lyre or a harp. On the right, you have a tambour, which is actually a Middle Eastern instrument, which also is round, but it's very long, thin neck. And this one only has 4 strings. So you have 4 strings on a tambour, you have 8 strings on a Nyatiti. The thing that makes them both so important is that each of them has something the other doesn't have. So the Nyatiti, you have this big bowl. It's kind of made out of a shallow gourd bowl with goat skin over the top. It's got lots of strings, but it doesn't have frets. And frets are those things that we push our fingers down onto in order to make notes. So all of those 8 strings always sound the same note unless you tune them individually. The tambour, on the other hand, has really long neck, but only has 3 or 4 strings, but you can fret it. You can change each string with your finger. So between one with lots of strings and no frets and one with barely any strings but lots of frets, we have the 2 earliest precursors to the guitar. Now, those came together essentially in something called the oud, O-U-D, it rhymes with food. And this is a Middle Eastern instrument that had the big round back, like you saw in the Nyatiti, also has lots and lots of strings and a neck where you can place your fingers in order to fret and strum. So you've got the best of both worlds, lots of strings, fretting for more notes. And this instrument, the oud, is where we sort of find the origin of things that today run the gamut from guitars to mandolins to banjos to anything with frets and strings.
Quick question, Harvey.
Sure.
On those first 2 instruments, as a collector, how do you run across those?
Well, interestingly enough, I think I can go backwards. Is this going backwards?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. The Nyatiti I actually came upon in Kenya, now 40 some odd years ago. And it was before I started collecting. I was just struck by the fact that they were getting, the locals were getting lots of cool sounds out of something that had no frets. The tambour is a more recent acquisition because as we began to go through the history that I'm going through now, we wanted to find out where the intersection of these worlds came. And so the Nyatiti I've had in my collection for a long time, which is now part of the museum's collection. And the tambour we had actually made for us in, a gentleman I believe in Iraq made that for us maybe 20 years ago.
Oh, cool.
So and both of these instruments are still regularly played. I mean, they're still very culturally important instruments to the Middle East and Eastern Africa. Now, jumping back in, I showed you the oud a second ago. The oud was a sort of a Middle Eastern instrument, but it came into Europe via Spain, which was called the Iberian Peninsula hundreds of years ago. It was brought over by the Muslims, who at that time were a much more advanced culture than anything seen in Europe. And they brought the oud with them as they invaded what we know today as Portugal, Spain, and parts of France. And essentially, it became the de facto instrument of Western Europe. as the Europeans got used to being dominated by the Moors, as we called them, they created their own version of the oud, which is called the lute. And the lute, the word lute basically comes from the Arabic word alud, say it quickly, it's kind of lute, alud, lute. And even today, people who build guitars are still called luthiers because we trace the origin of the guitar back directly to the lute. One thing that you'll see here on the lute on the right-hand side is you actually see frets. And we talked about frets earlier on the tambour. But every modern guitar today, acoustic or electric, you fret the instrument. You put your finger on a different, in between little bars in order to get individual notes. So frets are extremely, extremely important in the evolution of the guitar, especially because the lute, as it was adopted from the oud, became Europe's version of a stringed instrument that they could call their own. Now,
is it safe to say the fret mimics the keys of a piano in a way, in that it individualizes the notes? Or
it does in a way, yes. It doesn't. Yes, you can assign a different note to them, like you can in a piano. But as this illustration shows here, when you have a violin which has no frets, you can slide your fingers up and down the neck, and there's no individual precise spot. It's what makes the violin both an extremely beautiful and oftentimes horrendous instrument to listen to, because players have to be extremely precise as to where they place their fingers. On the guitar, based on the oud, you know instinctively where to put your fingers. There's no kind of wrong in-between spaces to put your fingers. So frets became very important for allowing people of all capabilities to know where they were supposed to put their fingers. And that came from the lute. The lute became immensely popular throughout Europe. You'll see it in paintings by Caravaggio, by almost every Renaissance master of both Italy and France. Here you see people playing lutes of different sizes and different forms. They were very, very important part of society because obviously it was before recorded music, and playing the lute was something that allowed people to gather together, listen to music, and occasionally sing songs together.
I find these early paintings pretty interesting, and when you just said something about pre-recording, this may be the only way besides written music that they could record that this was actually happening.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we have lots of like you said, written out music that shows us the intention of the composer. But until you see gatherings like this and people actually playing them and fretting them and how they're holding their hands and whether they're using a pick or they're using their fingers to play, this gives us a real insight into how the instruments were used socially and individually as a personal form of expression. So the lute, as the derivation of the oud, was extremely popular, and was very popular from about the 700s, 700 AD until about the 1100s. And all of a sudden in the 1100s, we had the Crusades. Now the Crusades, obviously this is not an actual photo of anybody in the Crusades, but hopefully most people will recognize the characters. The Crusades were originally intended to drive the Moors, who, as I mentioned, were Muslims, to drive them out of Europe, and for the papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, to regain control of the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, Spain, and part of France. So the Crusades eventually were successful and pushed the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula and reclaimed it as part of Europe for the Holy Roman Empire. This caused a bit of problem in the aftermath, which was that now that the Europeans were free of their Moorish oppressors, there was a concern that the instruments they used, especially the lute, which was derived from the oud, still felt like it was part of Moorish culture. And here we're going to embark on two stories happening simultaneously, and I leave it to you which one you want to believe. But the notion was that if music was going to continue to be played in the Iberian Peninsula, it couldn't be continued to be played on the lute because it was too reminiscent of the oud, which was too reminiscent of the Moorish oppression. So, according to legend, the luthiers got together and said, we want to continue to make beautiful music and we want to continue to make beautiful instruments, but we no longer want to be reminded of the oppression of the Moors and the things that they influenced. We need to come up with a different instrument while still creating, having a way to create beautiful music. And the guild said, well, we need something that's really ultimately very Spanish, very Iberian. We want to give tribute to the most beautiful things that we have here in Spain. And the idea was floated that, well, the most beautiful thing we have in Spain is, of course, the Spanish woman. So perhaps we should create an instrument that mimics the shape of beautiful women. And so you have the incurved sides, which even today, the thin, narrow part we call the waist, the wider part we call the hips, the top part we call the shoulders. And it changed the nature of, obviously, the way it looked, but the way we approach the instrument. Now, that's a great story. We're changing the shape so it now resembles a Spanish woman, and every time we play it, we'll be embracing the legacy and the imagery of a Spanish woman. The reality, again, a different second story, but it's up to you to decide, is that if you take the shape of the oud and the lute, it's got a round back. It's very pear-shaped and it's round. Imagine a big bowl sitting on your lap. It tends to slide. It's hard to hold on to. Well, what if you cut a notch into part of that bowl so that it would rest comfortably on your knee? And since you're doing that, what if you put another matching notch on the top where you can rest your elbow so that you can get a firmer grip on the body of the guitar and hold it closer to you? Now, that would have been ergonomics before anybody had ever heard the term ergonomics. It fits close to your body, it doesn't slip. So it's up to you. Were they creating an instrument that truly did mimic the beauty of the Spanish woman, or did they finally decide to make it a little easier to play?
I feel like it's probably a little of both.
Well, we let people decide because no one knows for sure. But what we call the shape of the guitar today is called S-curves or incurves. And it's obviously not that oval teardrop pear shape that the oud and the lute had. Mm-hmm. The first instruments to ever have this incurved S-woman shape was called the vihuela. And the vihuela was created in Spain right at the time that the Moors were being finally driven out during the Crusades and the Reconquista. And the vihuela had many strings, could have as few as 6, could have 12, could sometimes have 14 or 16. Usually had about 12 strings. And they were very ornate, as you can see here. These are photos of the only 3 remaining vihuelas in the world. And we had a luthier go to France and hand make a copy of the one that's currently held in Paris that we have on display that mimics this right down to the same kind of strings that were used back in the 1400s. So the vihuela is the first time we see the guitar shape in a way that we recognize today. We also start to get the first inkling of the name. We talked a little bit last week about all the different instruments around the world that had names like guitar. You had guitarra, sitar, guitar, guitarn, guitar. There's so many things I can't even pronounce them. And all of these began to apply to an instrument that had the S-shaped body, and had anywhere from 6 to about 12 strings. And by the early 1800s, Europeans started calling all instruments that had that shape and those number of strings guitars. You know, the Italian, French, and Spanish variations are all very obviously guitar.
Yeah.
But that was the beginning of calling the instrument guitar, and it's the same name, obviously, that we use today. So by the end of the 1700s, we had the first instruments that were definitively called the guitar. They're no longer called the vihuela. They no longer resembled the oud or the lute. And they were very small, as you can see in the photos here. They were used much like the lute was. They were used for playing in parlors, for people to sit around and sing, or for small performances of just one person playing a composed piece. And interestingly enough, throughout most of the 1800s, the majority of players were women. Part of that is because they were small instruments. They were easy to hold and to pluck. And men, you know, as was true of the time, were out doing a lot of agricultural work and the beginnings of factory work. Women basically provided the entertainment by being guitar players. Interesting note, in the 1900s, and we'll see why, women stopped playing guitar as much. And yet today in the 2000s, guitar companies are beginning to reintroduce these small guitars to try and entice more women of all ages to play the guitar again like they used to in the 1800s.
Harvey, do you know how many of these were produced? Like, I would imagine you'd have to be pretty wealthy to own a guitar, or maybe.
No, you know, no.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to. That's a good question, but
Yeah.
initially, guitars were the biggest seller of guitars in the 1800s and early 1900s was Sears Roebuck. There probably aren't many people watching who know Sears Roebuck, but it's what Sears was before it became Sears today. And for a century and a half, the Sears Roebuck catalog was this big, huge, thick book. I would say telephone-sized book, but we don't use telephone books anymore.
Yeah.
But, you know, 1,000 or more pages where you could buy anything from sewing machines to bathing suits to pre-built homes to guitars. And guitars were actually relatively cheap by the late 1800s because they were being mass produced by more than a dozen different companies, a couple of which were in Illinois, but many throughout the Midwest that were just pumping them out like they were pumping out sewing machines. So every family could afford a guitar almost that couldn't afford a keyboard or a piano. And that became a way that it ended up disseminating throughout America. Later on in the 1950s, that same catalog featured some of the earliest electric guitars, and people like Bob Dylan and Jimi Hendrix got their first electric guitars from the Sears catalog.
Nice.
So as the guitar became more popular, it went from being a front parlor room instrument or one played in the kitchen or maybe with a small group of friends to being parts of bands. And the thing about the guitar, especially in the late 1800s, it wasn't very loud. The guitar, you see there are two here in this photo. The guitar was playing in bands where you had things like banjos or piano players and drummers and violinists. All of those instruments are much more inherently loud and noisier than a guitar. And guitar players found that they really couldn't be heard when they were playing with other band members, because again, as it went out of the parlors and guitar players joined bands, much as they would 100 years later with electric bands, they found themselves lost in the din. And part of the problem for this or with this, is the shape of the guitar and the size of it. Most people think, and it's a very common thing to think, is that depending on how big the hole is in that guitar or how deep it is, that it's going to be much louder. And that's not true at all. The one thing that gives a guitar its loudness is the top, that very front face of the guitar that faces out towards people when they're watching a guitarist, or when you're looking at it in a store. That front piece vibrates the sound waves that are made by strings and pushes them forward. The hole in the depth of the guitar create bass notes and sounds, make it boomier. They don't make it any louder. And in order for a guitar to be loud, that top has to be very, very flexible. So that piece of wood where the green arrow is pointing, you know this from having worked on a guitar, building a guitar. That piece of wood is literally the thickness of a popsicle stick.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it has to be that thin so that it can vibrate almost, think of one of those singing saws. You've got to have it wobble and vibrate in order to push air out and about. If it's too sturdy, if it's too thick, it won't vibrate. It's kind of like playing a xylophone on a floor. You don't get any sound, but raise it up off the floor and you start getting vibrations from the air around it. So the guitar didn't have a lot of inherent design that made it loud. The banjo does. It has a resonator that's made of metal that reflects and uses that metallic sound of a metal resonator to, many people call it an annoying racket, but it does make a loud racket.
I am a banjo player as well, so I know the scenario of being in an acoustic band, and the banjo is probably 10 times louder.
Easily. And the same with a keyboard. You've got a much bigger soundboard when you've got a piano.
Yeah.
And drums, even a violin, because it's got a curved top that has more surface area like this, tends to be louder than a guitar. So you had the guitar moving out of parlors into bands, but taking a backseat to louder instruments. Well, a gentleman, a Spanish luthier in the mid-1800s named Antonio de Torres Jurado, who we just called Torres, determined, he was the first guy to determine that it was how flexible you made that top soundboard that really projected the sound. But as a side story here, he went so far as to enter a luthier competition in Spain, and everyone said, no, it's the shape and the depth. He said, no, the shape and the depth doesn't matter. That is what gives you the tone and the boomingness, the bassiness. He said, no, it's the soundboard. He ended up making a guitar that he entered in the competition. It was essentially made out of paper mache, with a top made out of spruce wood. And it ended up being louder than anybody else's guitar because he made the top so flexible. He showed that the sides and the back, while contributing to the tone, didn't matter as much to the volume. So ever since Torres came up with this idea, we now know that the place you're going to get most of the loudness is from the top of the guitar. So how do we work on getting the guitar louder? Well, Torres showed that you could make, the more flexible you could make a top, the louder it would be because it moved more air. One of the drawbacks was that guitars weren't very loud because their strings were made of something we call catgut. Most people probably don't know what catgut is, but through most of the 1800s, even into the mid-1900s, catgut was used to not only for guitar strings, but they were used for medical sutures when you had stitches. They were used for tennis rackets. A lot of tennis rackets, even up until the 1960s, had catgut. And archery bowstrings were made of catgut. And so most people wonder, what catgut is. I hate to be the person that tells them that you have to take a room full of kittens and then, get them together. And I'm not going to be that person because you don't need kittens to get catgut. What you do need, you need sheep. And basically, you know, inventive farmers and herders throughout history have figured out how to use every part of an animal that is herded, whether it be a cow or a sheep or a pig. Sheep intestines, when dried out, are extremely tough. And they were used originally for rope, and then they became used for the strings on an instrument because it could be wound very, 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 very thinly and still plucked, almost like, you know, we think of as rubber bands today. Think of stretching a rubber band. Why are they called catgut and not sheep gut? That we don't really know for sure. We think it's because when musicians traveled around Europe, they carried long strands of coiled up, or they carried coiled up strands, long when they were stretched out, of gut, sheep gut with them in order to replace broken strings. Mm-hmm. And this was their kit of gut, or at least what we called their gut kit. Huh. Somewhere along the line, we think that the kit of gut and gut kit became cat gut, like kitty corner and catty corner and things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And so today we have cat gut strings, which are still used by numerous players. But
I know a few.
Yeah, they break very easily, and as we'll see if we get to it, they were eventually replaced by nylon in the 1930s. And 1940s when DuPont was looking for a post-war use for parachute nylon. The strings that were used for parachutes, they started calling up guitarists and saying, "You think we can use this instead of sheep intestines?" And ultimately that paid off for them. So cool. No cats are harmed in the making of catgut. No kittens are hurt. Now, catgut, as I was saying, it's very thin. You can kind of think of tennis racket netting, and it doesn't make a lot of noise. It kind of rattles a little when you play it. So, especially in folk music circles, people started using metal wire for strings because they're a little bit louder. They vibrated a little bit more. They made the wood resonate more. The problem was that soundboard that Torres had come up with, as we said, was the thickness of a popsicle stick. Mm-hmm. So if you tightened a lot of metal strings on it, you could snap it. Imagine snapping a popsicle stick. You can do it with one hand.
Yeah.
When you put metal strings on a guitar, you're applying several hundred pounds of pressure, up to several hundred pounds of pressure. And that wasn't working. So putting metal strings worked for a while, but it didn't really affect a big change because it destroyed the guitars. That all changed with a gentleman named Christian Martin, C.F. Martin. Today, the Martin Guitar Company is still probably the most well-known acoustic guitar company in the world. Absolutely. It's also one of the oldest family-run businesses in America to this day. It's been around since the early 1830s. It was originally begun in New York. It's now in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, still run by C.F. Martin, I think the fifth. And the original C.F. Martin came up with what you see here on the right, a way to keep that really thin top, but to brace it in such a way, almost think of the bracing on the outside of the John Hancock Tower in Chicago.
Yeah.
It kept the building lightweight. They didn't have to put in all this concrete that you did in a lot of other skyscrapers, but the bracing allows it to work with the material, in this case, the spruce top, and vibrate without breaking. So a lot of vibration, but also a lot of structural integrity. So you've got this bracing, again, like you see in bridges or on the John Hancock Tower, that doesn't make it too stiff, but still allows it to have a nice projection of sound. This kind of bracing, which we all use today in some form or another, allowed guitarists to always use steel strings. And most guitars that you see today, acoustic guitars, have steel strings because this kind of guitar bracing keeps the guitar from snapping in half.
I know during my research into making a guitar and getting to know more about guitars, almost every maker has a different way of bracing.
Correct.
And they, the image you had there, they all carved them a little differently.
Right. Yeah, one of
A lot of different thoughts about it.
there are, and this is X bracing, there's Y bracing, there's many kinds of different bracing, and it all comes down to how do we make the guitar louder? We've got the shape, we've got the neck, we've got the frets. We need to make it louder because we're competing with these other band instruments. Remember,
essentially, you want it to be right at the point where it's about to break, but it doesn't.
Right. And old guitars do break. They end up snapping, they end up separating because they are so thin. And wood tends to dry out. But when they're in their prime, they can be extremely loud and flexible because of the way this bracing is put in. The louder, the better, obviously. The innovations continued, not so much to the shape of the guitar, but to the top. And Orville Gibson, whose name graces the Gibson Guitar Company, another originally a family-owned but long since sold off to corporations, he started carving the tops of guitars so that they resembled violin tops. And for any of you who happen to have a violin or want to take a close look at a violin, it doesn't have a flat top like most guitars do. It has a curved top that kind of arches in the middle like a little bell curve. And that gives it a little bit more surface area to vibrate and therefore project more sound waves. So it's all about putting more sound out into the air by creating a thin, pliable surface that pushes air. So Orville Gibson's claim to fame was creating the archtop guitar, which is very popular even today with jazz players, simply because they are so loud and they're beautiful sounding in a way that flat top guitars like the Martin are not. They just have a different sound to them. The thing that we end up with and these are all Gibsons, is that as we start incorporating larger surface area, we start getting a little insane in terms of the size of the guitar. on the right-hand side, you'll see a Gibson harp guitar, and we have one of these in the exhibit.
Oh, great.
It's basically a 6-string guitar with 10 more strings that vibrate in sympathy like drones, almost like a harp. Yeah. But the idea was now this could be louder than anything else. Be louder than banjos, be louder than mandolins, because you've got this big, huge piece of furniture, essentially, that's vibrating, almost 3 feet of wood and pushing it out. The problem was it really was a better piece of furniture than it was a guitar. It's so huge. You see this guy sitting here, yeah. It covers half his body. You can't pick it up and walk around with it. But it's a beautiful instrument. We have it. Its lifespan originally was from about 1911 to maybe the 1920s. Beautiful, beautiful instrument, not very practical. So we get back to this problem. How are we going to keep making instruments or how are we going to create new instruments that continue to keep playing with bands and need to be a little bit louder? Well, the biggest change came in 1915. And in 1915, the Pan-Pacific International Exhibition was held in San Francisco. And that was basically a World's Fair. It was to celebrate the anniversary of the opening of the Panama Canal. And the single most popular pavilion at this World's Fair was the Hawaiian Pavilion. Hawaii in 1915 was not yet part of America. And I don't have a clock. How are we doing on time?
Oh, we are good.
Okay.
We're good.
So people fell in love with Hawaiian music after seeing this pavilion. And almost overnight, Hawaiian music became the most popular form of music by far in America.
Wow.
Some of the earliest recordings, certainly sheet music, live performances, dwarfed everything, dwarfed country music, dwarfed early jazz. People were swept away by Hawaiian music.
I had no idea, and there were many people that tuned in last week that this was totally new to them. So
Yeah,
very,
it was all because of
very
this sort of World's Fair. And so Hawaiian bands started coming over from Hawaii and touring the country, and a lot of musicians in America started their own Hawaiian bands. Now, in a Hawaiian band, you have everything from piano to kettle or to large drums to stand-up bass and singers and various other forms of percussion. The main instrument, which you can see in this gentleman holding in the center, sitting down, is a lap steel guitar. It's played with a piece of metal and strung across or run across a guitar that's laying in his lap. It's kind of hard to see it that way. That's the primary instrument. But once you get in a room of more than 15 people in an audience, you can't hear that instrument anymore.
Yeah.
It's now just, you don't hear it. And the guitars were drowned out yet again. They weren't loud enough. So you had a guy named George Beecham. And here's a good example. Here's George playing his guitar on his lap with a slide in his left hand across the fretboard, creating that kind of sing-songy Hawaiian sound that you get. He had his own Hawaiian band that he created, but they were so popular they started playing theaters. And everyone else in his band except him could be heard. And he was the band leader, and he did not take kindly the idea.
That's no fun.
Yeah, the band leader can't be heard.
Yeah.
So he worked with a couple of brothers named the Dopieras. They were from Czechoslovakia. And their name has since been combined to Dobros. And what he basically did was turn the guitar into an entire metal creation. They, instead of using wood, they used metal. Metal resonates better than wood. And also, as you'll see on the right here, the center hole section is actually an inverted speaker cone. It vibrates outward to push music out. And so it vibrated wonderfully. It made incredibly loud sound, but it's very tinny and it sounds very metally. If you think a banjo sounds metally, add even more metal.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't useful for playing folk songs or country songs or bluegrass songs. But Beecham introduced this, and it worked well for Hawaiian bands, and worked long enough that it became that the lap steel, the dopiera, dobro, became popular. And here you kind of see a better example of the inverted cone that kind of vibrates under her right hand, pushing sound outward. But now we're getting even bigger Hawaiian rooms. Now we're in the 1930s, and they're playing auditoriums. And see all these people here, none of them are hearing the guitar player, no matter how big they make it or how much metal they add to it. They're getting drowned out by dancers and horn players and singers and everyone else. So Beecham, still kind of upset that he couldn't hear himself, ended up going on to do probably the greatest thing that ever happened to the guitar, which was introduce electricity. But we're going to talk about that next week. So we say goodbye to George here, and we finish off our acoustic side with the Martin Guitar Company realized that loudness was just a hugely limiting factor. If you couldn't be heard, you were going to play a different instrument. And people like Hank Williams, shown here, just didn't want to give up the guitar, but their bands were louder than they were. So Martin took that bracing I showed you a little bit earlier and created the biggest instrument they could, not as big as the harp guitar, but as big as it could be and still be held and playable. And they fitted it to somebody like many people like Hank Williams, who found it really comfortable to play. Now at this point, it's too large for most women to play because it's too big for their hands. Their bodies are smaller. And the guitar now goes firmly into the realm primarily of male players. But this large Martin guitar was called the Dreadnought. and it was named after the biggest, most feared battleship in the world. It was very aggressive. If you want to be loud and you want people to hear you, you're going to play a dreadnought. And instantly, and this happened in the 1930s, instantly the dreadnought became the definitive guitar that everybody from Elvis to Jimmy Page to James Taylor to Crosby, Stills and Nash would play going forward because it was so big and loud. And if you compare, both of these are instruments that are in the exhibit. You know, we have this 6-string from 1806 on the right-hand side. It's literally a fraction of the size when you think about its surface area relative to the Martin on the left.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the Martin is so much louder. It's got steel strings and it's got this bracing. So all of a sudden you've got this great loud instrument, loud enough for the time, loud enough for the 30s and the 40s. Now it's a little too big for a lot of people, especially for women, but it's making a lot of noise and it's changing the way the guitar is used, especially in bands, especially in country bands. Electricity is going to come into this right about now, and we're going to talk about that next week. So there you have the thumbnail, the thumbnail history of the acoustic guitar from 5,000 years ago up to the Rural Electrification Act of 1936.
So cool. Unbelievable. I mean, it really is unbelievable, especially when you look at that much earlier 6-string from Spain, and you see that, I mean, not a whole lot has changed. It's just, it's slowly evolved, and I have played a lot of parlor guitars, which are a similar size to the one on the right, and the volume is nothing like a dreadnought.
And it's very much designed for intimate settings.
Yeah.
You had Hank Williams or Elvis playing on the radio.
Yeah.
When they had a bass player and a drummer or a keyboard player behind them, they had to be loud. And when you've got those thick metal strings and a big wooden body, finally you've got something that's loud enough to hold its own.
Okay, so we do have one question here, HP, as we kind of wrap up.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing and come to real life here.
Okay, sounds good. Somebody is asking, what is the most famous acoustic guitar? I'm guessing they're asking like from a player. I guess you can go at that however you want to. Maybe historically, what
you know, it's hard to, you can't put it really in any one particular person's hands. The Martin D28 and D45, two guitars that were incredibly popular starting in the late 50s, early 60s, were played by people like Paul McCartney, Jimmy Page, as I said, James Taylor, Cat Stevens, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Joni Mitchell, Joan Baez.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the most famous actual acoustic guitar, I would have to say right now, it's probably Willie Nelson's Trigger.
That's what I was thinking. That's hilarious.
Willie Nelson has had that guitar,
yeah,
I think for 60 years.
Yeah.
And basically, if you see pictures of it, and I don't have one on me, he's played it so long that he plays with his hand and his fingernails, not always with a pick. Fingernails have actually, over the course of 5 or 6 decades, gently ripped a hole into the face of that guitar. So in addition to, let's see if I can do it here. In addition to the real sound hole, which is here, he's got another hole where the pick guard is here, where his fingers have eaten through it.
Yeah.
All those years of playing. And I would have to say that's the only one that's most readily recognizable, because, you know, for most acoustic guitars, they do seem to a lot of us interchangeable. Electrics are a little more identifiable because they have different shapes and different colors. But as far as the actual fame of an individual acoustic, I'm going to have to give it to Willie.
Cool. I would agree. They're also asking, what is your favorite acoustic guitar to play?
You know, it's funny. Almost every acoustic guitar maker has a different sound that they have and that they're known for.
Yeah.
Um, for instance, that's a Martin D28, which I love playing for acoustic. But I have a Taylor 12 string, which is loud and insanely beautiful when you're in a small room. I also have an Ovation, which is a round back guitar, which I use to record with because it's really good for dampening those vibrations the way it's designed. So
those have like a is it plastic or resin
yeah,
back?
they have a carbon fiber back,
Fiber.
and that helps. It allows the front of the guitar to vibrate, but keeps the other vibrations sort of contained within the guitar. You know, it's a joke amongst anybody who owns a guitar or anybody who plays for more than a couple of years that you can never have too many guitars. And
Yeah.
it, you know, if you read articles about anybody from the Beatles to the Foo Fighters, they've got roomfuls of guitars,
Yeah.
20, 30, 40 guitars, trying to get the right sound. And it's a function of not only the kind of string you have on it, some strings are thicker than others, different manufacturers use different metal, composite metal. Some just are older and the wood itself is aged and creates a different sort of tone. So every guitar is unique. I'm happy just to have the ones I have.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, I think, hold on. Nope. Well, no other questions. So I think that that wraps up our night on the acoustic guitar. HP, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us, and
Oh, my pleasure.
super excited to have the exhibition coming later this year in September. Next week, same day, same time, next Wednesday, 6 o'clock our time. We'll be talking with HP again about the history of the electric guitar.
That's right. We'll pick up where we left off and things will get even louder then.
I'm looking forward to it.
Good, so am I.
Well, thank you so much, HP, and everybody out there, thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy what we're doing here.
Great, thank
Good
you.
night.
Have a good night.